Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, Lisa. Are you ready to do some troubleshooting today?
Oh, always love talking about hiccups and problems because that's the only way we get past them, right?
Oh, yes, for sure.
All right, so friends, before we jump into today's troubleshooting, just remember that thegardenersworkshop.com is where you're going to find everything you need for growing cut flowers, right? So, friends, drop in anytime. We'd love to have you over there. All right, Layne, lay it on us. What are we talking about today?
Well, I thought that for the month of September, we would do some different episodes on various troubles that people tend to have. And we're going to start off today with cool flower timing troubles. So we're just
Mm.
going to go through some very common questions that we hear at this time of year, like I missed my fall planting window, or I started too early, or I live in a warm climate where we don't get frost. When do I plant in that situation? So we're just going to talk about some timing questions that we commonly get and go through those and hopefully answer them.
Oh, that sounds awesome because I know that we get those often because I see them on social media too. Great. Let's get started.
Okay, so this is one of the most common questions I'm sure you see, Lisa. I know it's one of the most common I see as well. And it's, I missed my fall planting window. And should I wait until very early spring to plant, or should I just try planting past my optimal window? And this happens for so many different reasons. A lot of times people have just found out about cool flowers and they're so excited to jump in, but they calculate their dates and realize it's past that, or maybe life just got in the way, or they had a seedling disaster that didn't allow them to get their plants in the ground on time. So, what should someone do in this situation if they just completely missed their fall planting window?
Sure. So, and this is a frequent flyer, I guess I would call it.
Yes.
So, you can plant past your optimal date depending on circumstances, right? First off, it's really much easier to do this with transplants because you're starting your seeds indoors, you're walking out to your garden. And if it's gotten colder than so cold that you're feeling like your plants might not vigorously get established, you can do things to help them out. You can hoop and row cover, and that just really concentrates the sunshine during the day that can help your transplants. And I often say, putting a hoop and a lightweight row cover like buys you a month backwards in time. So that's the simplest thing to do. And you can do that even with direct sowing. But just know that when you plant seeds directly out in the garden, they need a level of warmth to break dormancy and to sprout. And that means you're going to have to provide that. And, hoops and row covers would definitely be a start. But if you're in the dead of winter, I think I'd skip the whole direct sowing thing, but transplants, you have a little bit more wiggle room if you just give them some extra TLC.
Lisa, we also should probably start by explaining when is the ideal fall planting window. How can someone easily calculate that?
Sure. So there's two planting windows typically in the cool flower concept. The first one is planting either transplants or seeds out in the garden 6 to 8 weeks before your first historical fall frost date. So that means my first frost date is typically mid-November. So that means from mid-September to October 1st is my optimal window. That's when I would be planting that stuff out in the garden. So that means if you're planting transplants, you will have started weeks before that to have the transplant ready to go in the ground. The second window is 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost. And so that's what we refer to as very early spring. So those are the two windows.
So, what is the potential issue with someone planting too late, Lisa? And how far beyond that window would you be willing to go for transplants if someone lives somewhere where the ground doesn't freeze?
So if your ground doesn't truly freeze, which now here where I live, it doesn't freeze. I mean, we've there you can almost always get a shovel in the ground. What happens is if you plant late and the ground is really cold, not just cool, which is what these cool season annuals really love, they just don't develop those roots. That's the whole point of planting at these times is to get these seedlings or these plants in the ground to establish a root system. So when spring comes, they hit the ground running, growing stems and vegetation, right? And when it is just flat out cold outside, they just kind of just sit there and wait or either die. If it's really cold, I mean, if you live in, zone 6 or 7 where it goes down into the teens and single digits, if those transplants are not rooted in, they literally don't have a leg to stand on. So how far beyond really depends on your conditions. I mean, here where I am in southeastern Virginia, we famously, in the middle of a run of cold weather, will have a week of 60 degrees. If you're going to have that and you look ahead 2 weeks and it's like, gosh, we're having like almost some early spring like weather here, I might go for it. But you really have to look at your conditions and think, are they actually going to put down roots in these kind of conditions? And it's not the best case, but, just kind of consider your conditions and what you're gambling. So you have to calculate your own risk.
And again, like you just mentioned, remember that there is still very early spring. So you do have another opportunity to plant if you did miss this one.
And I tell people, especially if you're just learning about cool flowers, to plant them at the wrong time just really sets you up to fail, and then you get discouraged because when you hit your sweet spot for planting, you just won't believe how easy this concept is and how amazing the plants are. And I just hate for people to get discouraged planting at the wrong time. I almost feel like saying, if it's more than a couple weeks, 3 or 4 weeks past your planting time and you're already into deep winter, just hang on till very early spring or put those seeds on your calendar for next fall.
Yeah. So if someone has missed their fall planting window, maybe you're a few weeks behind and you don't want to wait until very early spring to plant, so you're willing to take a bit of a risk, remember that you have a little more wiggle room with transplants compared to direct seeding.
Yes.
And like Lisa mentioned, using row cover, creating a little bit of a low tunnel, it's going to create a better environment for them and buy you a little extra time.
I tell you what does grow in the winter are your native weeds.
Oh,
So
yes.
oftentimes, like if you try to direct seed and they just don't, germinate and grow up to like help shade out the weeds, you'll go out and find an entire bed of chickweed that is just covered.
So we just need to find some weeds that can be used as cut flowers then, right?
It's true. It's true. So that's all just part of the discouragement part. So it's really hard. I mean, I'm trying to say to people more often, you just need to find your dates, put it on your calendar, and catch the next planting window for the best results.
All right, moving on to our next question. And this is going to be the exact opposite of what we just discussed. So this is going to be, I miscalculated my fall planting window and I actually planted out too early. What are the risks of doing this? And another reason we often see people planting out too early is, again, they just learned about cool flowers. They were very excited and they couldn't stop themselves from getting started, which I can totally understand, by the way. But what's the issue with planting out too early, Lisa?
Sure. So there's twofold problems here. One is like for us right now, I mean, it's almost 100 degrees outside, which happens here in southeastern Virginia. No cool season annual seed is going to germinate under those conditions. So oftentimes we sow our seeds out in the garden too early, and the conditions are just not conducive to cool season hardy annuals. They don't sprout. And you have a total failure because most people aren't just planting one type of seed. They're planting 10 or 12 of the direct seeded ones, and they lose them all. And then the other problem is if you're planting transplants, and they will suffer through the heat most often. But then they continue to start not just putting down roots, they vegetatively grow. So they grow top growth. And they get big, and you don't want a big plant to go into winter because it'll never survive.
And the other thing with the plants growing too much is we always get a lot of emails from people saying, my plants are actually budding up or even blooming beforehand.
Yes. I mean, if only that would happen soon enough before winter set in so you could actually use them. But that isn't often the case.
So what would you recommend someone do if they realize they have planted out too early? What should they do? And we have mentioned before that if you know you've done this, sometimes it's not the worst idea to start another round of what we like to call insurance seedlings, meaning they may ultimately end up in the compost heap. You might not need them, but they're there growing and ready in case you need to swap something out.
And that's a really great point, Layne. And that's kind of being a commercial grower. You do a lot of that kind of stuff. You have to back yourself up. And I remember one particular year, I mean, we were in high production. So, I mean, I had probably 40 or 4,500 foot beds of cool flowers alone, and fall just wouldn't stop. And our Ami Magus is the one that I can remember most distinctively, was like thigh high, almost hip high. And I just knew
Oh, wow.
they're really vulnerable anyway. That's one of the ones that, depending on how bad the winter is here. And I mean, there was nothing to be done. You can't cover them. You can't, I mean, and it's not worth trying to cover large plants like that to protect them from winter. You're going to lose the battle. Don't waste your time and morale doing that. So the insurance plants are it. But if they're mediocre size and they start to bud up, we just hoop and cover them only when it gets really cold, like below 25 degrees, because if you hoop and cover them too soon, that's just going to encourage them to grow more. But yeah, that's a tough situation. You have to really play it by ear, but being able to just plant again is the simplest solution. I didn't used to be able to say that, but now I see how much frustration, distress, and then you end up losing them anyway. Why even do that? Why not just start over? It's easier. Far easier, less labor.
And we also do have an episode number 63, where we really went into detail about what to do if you do have plants that are trying to bud up or bloom in the fall. So check out episode 63 if you want a more detailed discussion of that. Lisa, based on your conditions where you're located, how early would you say is way too early for someone to plant?
Now,
yeah.
So my window is mid-September to 1st of October. And as I have mentioned in the past, as the weather is, crazily unpredictable, we've actually pushed our transplanting window a couple of weeks beyond my October 1st, just because it just has gone on so warm. But I don't really do that with direct sowing. I keep that in that window. But what we hear, and I see people on social media speaking of, is that, they're living in the South and they've already tried to direct sow their seeds and they're belly aching about that they aren't germinating. Well, that makes perfect sense to me. Direct sowing is where you see the most obvious quick failures. With transplants, they suffer a little longer. You know what I mean? They'll grow bigger, but it takes weeks and sometimes even months for you to see the error of your ways. But too early is there's a reason that you plant 6 to 8 weeks before your frost date, because the weather used to behave like that's when you gave your stuff, a seed or a transplant, time to either sprout and get established or to be planted as a transplant and become established before winter starts, when they go dormant. But you don't want a lot of top growth happening in the fall.
So if you have planted out way too early and you're pretty convinced of it, again, you can start another round of insurance seedlings in case you end up needing them, in case the first batch starts blooming or something crazy. And also, as we always say, please be sure to mark your calendar for the next year so that you don't repeat the same mistake unnecessarily again.
Exactly. Having that calendar, the best practice is having the calendar that runs my farm accessible all the time to easily walk up and write that down, and always use a pencil and note these dates of what you've missed. Or, when I'm talking about a flower, when you're talking about a flower that's blooming, it's typically not the time to plant it. You need to go to your calendar and figure out when you should plant it so that you can catch it on the next season. So that's good advice.
All right, now we're going to move on to another question, and this is about climate. So there are some people that live in really warm climates and they actually don't even get frost. And of course, the cool flowers' typical planting timelines are based on your frost date. That's how you know when to plant. So the question is, I live in a warm climate where we don't get frost. Can I still plant cool flowers? And if so, when?
So that is a really great question. I think that if someone lives in the tropics, I would feel fairly safe saying you may not be able to grow cool flowers. If it's above 80 degrees all the time, right? But if you live in the deep south where you may not get frost during the winter months, but it gets cold outside, it goes down to 40 or 50 degrees. Instead of banking on that 6 to 8 weeks before your first fall frost, you want to kind of look at a 6 to 8 week window or so before your coldest period. And that way you can get your stuff in the ground and get them up and germinated or either established. And for them to then have that cool period, they don't require cool. Cool is just their desired growing conditions. And that just kind of like is their jam, right? And that's, you want them to be in the ground when that time comes so that they can do a little bit of growing and then they'll be better equipped to face the spring-like conditions whenever they occur for you.
And I just want to circle back to what you said about maybe someone in tropical sort of conditions. Even if you can't be successful perhaps with cool flowers, there are so many other flowers that we wouldn't be able to even dream of growing here for you to enjoy and experiment with.
It's true.
Okay, so if you do live in a frost-free, warmer climate, but not somewhere that's tropical and 80 degrees all the time, like Lisa said, plan on planting out around 6 to 8 weeks before the coldest time period you typically experience.
Yeah.
And as always, keep good records so you can adjust your timing or even which flowers you're planting going forward.
And, Layne, people that live in the South, zones 8B and 9, probably can grow all of the cool flowers, but they have a more difficult time actually finding their sweet spot. And then once you do find it, you can really grow probably all of them and fall plant them. Really, in people in the deep South, there's really no reason. Very early spring planting doesn't really give those plants time to get up and get established before the heat and humidity starts. So fall planting all the way in those areas. And I think that once you've experimented for 2 or 3 years, you will have that unlocked and you can really probably grow all of them.
Yeah. And I do know a lot of people in the South, even if they still live somewhere where they get frost, but they're just generally in a warm climate, they might shift that 6 to 8 weeks before their frost to more like 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Or a lot of people just go with 4. So it really is just about experimenting and finding what works best in your conditions. The 6 to 8 week timeline is just a jumping off point.
And, friends, if y'all are listening to this at a podcast app, just want you to know that over on YouTube, Layne has put together a beautiful slideshow.
Yes. All right. Well, that was it for this episode on some different timing questions that we frequently get asked. I hope that helped answer some of the questions that you might be having. Remember, you can leave a comment over on YouTube if you do have any additional questions, and you can also use the form linked in the show notes to ask those and submit them in case you want us to potentially cover them in a future episode. And thank you so much for joining us again, everyone. Please be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, and please share with a friend if you're enjoying Seed Talk. And thank you again to everyone for being here.
And friends, over at thegardenersworkshop.com, you may not know this, but Layne and I have a course out called Cool Flowers, Seed to Harvest. And if you love this podcast, you are going to adore this comprehensive course that takes you literally from seed to harvest. Layne, how many flowers are featured over there?
36. Yeah.
36 different cool flowers. And in the field demonstrations, seed sowing demonstrations by Layne. And so, friends, if you really want all your questions answered about cool flowers, that's the place to start. All right, Layne, thanks for another great episode. And until we meet again, friends, ciao.
Bye.